Social unrest. The income of lords was thus badly hit. It declined as agriculture prices came down and the wages of laborers increased. In desperate, they tried to give up the money contract and they entered into the revived land services. They was violently opposed by the peasants, particularly the better educated and the more prosperous one. In the 1323 peasants revolt in the Flanders, in 1358 in France and 1381 in England. Through these rebellions were ruthless crusades, ruthless crushed. It is significantly that they occurred with the most violent intensive in those areas which has experienced the prosperity of income expansion, a sign that peasants would attempting to protect the gains they had made in previous centuries. Despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasants' opposite ensured that the old feudal relation could not be reimposed. The money economy was too far advanced to be reversed. Therefore, through the Lord succeeded in the crushing the revolt, the peasants ensured that the feudal privileges of early days could not be reinvented. 11th to 14th century. 1066 nomadic defeated Anglo-Saxon and conqueror England. Catholic being built in the France in 1315 to 17. Great famine in the Europe. 1347 Black Death, the plague. 1338 to 1461 Hundreds Year War between England and France. 1381 Peasants Revolt. Political changes. Developments in the political spheres paralleled the social process. In the 15th and the 16th century, European kings strengthened their military and the financial power. The powerful new states they created were as significant for Europe as economic changes that were occurring. Historians have therefore called this king the new monarchs. Louis XI in France, Maximilian in the Australia, Harry VI in the England and Isabella in the Ferdinand in Spain were absolute rulers who started the process of organizing standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy and national taxation, and in Europe and the Portugal began to play a role in the Europe's expansion overseas. The most important reason for the triumph of these monarchies was the social changes which has taken place in the 12th and the 13th century. The dissolution of the feudal system of lord and the vassalage and slow rate of economic growth had given the first opportunity to king to increase their control over the powerful and the not so powerful subjects. Ruler dispensed with the system of feudal levies for their armies and introduced the professionally trained infantry equipped with the guns and the sieges artillery directly under their control. The resistance of the aristocracy crumbled in the face of the firepower of the kings. The new monarchy of 1461 to 1559, new monarchy in France. 1474 to 1556, new monarchs in Spain. 1485 to 1547, new monarchs in England. By the increasing taxes, monarchs got enough revenue to support large armies and thus defeated and expanded their frontiers and overcome internal resistance to royal authority. Centralization, however, did not occur without the resistance from the autocracy. A common thread running through the all types of the opposition to the monarchs was the question of taxations. In England, rebellion occurred were put down in the 1497, 1536, 1547, 1549, 1553. In France, Louis XI, 1461 to 83, to wage a long struggle against the dukes and the princes, lesser nobles, often members of the social assemblies, resistance this royalty usurpations of their power. The religious war in France in the 16th century were a part of contrast between themselves into loyalists. It is for this reason that royal absolution had been called a modified form of feudalism. Preciously, the same class of peoples who had being ruled in the feudal system, the lords continue to dominate the political scenes. They were given permanent position in the administrative service, but new regimes were different in some important ways. The king has no longer at the apex of the pyramid, where loyalty have been a matter of the personal dependence and trust. He was now at the center of the elaborated courtier society and a network of the patron-client relationships. All the monarch, weak or powerful, needed the cooperation of those who could command authority. Patronage became the means of ensuring such cooperation. The patronage could be given or obtained by the means of the money. Therefore, money became an important way in which non-aristocratic elements like merchants and bankers could gain access to the courts. They lent money to the kings who accused it to pay the wages of the soldier. Rulers thus made a space for the non-feudal elements in the state system. The later history of the France and the England was to be shaped by these changes in the power structure. In the region of the child King Louis 13 of the France in 1614, a meeting was held of the French Consultative Assembly known as the Estates General, with 3 houses to be represented in the 3 states order, clergy, nobility and the rest. After this it was not summoned again for the nearly 2 centuries till 1789, because the king did not want to share its power with the 3 orders. What happened in England was very different. Even before the Norman conquest, the Anglo-Saxon had an great council which the king had to consult before imposing any tax. This developed into what is called the Parliament, which consisted of the House of Lords and the members, which were the Lords and the clergy, and House of Commons representing towns and the rural areas. King Charles I ruled for 11 years between 1629 to 40 without calling Parliament. When he was forced to call it because he needed money, a section of Parliament decided to go war against him and later executed him and established a republic. This did not last long and monarchy was destroyed, but on the condition that Parliament could be regularly. Today, France has a republic form of government and England has a monarchy. This is because of the different direction that the histories of the 2 countries took after the 17th century. Exercise that we are going to do now. First question is, describe 2 features of the early feudal society in the France. 2 features of the early feudal society is, first, early feudal society in the France was based on the relationship of the lord and peasants. The peasants has to offer labor in the service of their lords. And second is, the lord enjoyed special status. His order was supreme. Nobody could deny his order. Second, how did long-term changes in the population level affected economy and the society in the Europe? The long-term changes in the population level affected the economic and society is, the changes brought about new changes in the agriculture production. Production reaches at its peak. Good quality of goods was produced. It increased the life expectancy rate. A number of towns came into being. They also became the center of trade and commerce. Society became more advanced and civilized. Why did knights became a distinct group, and when did they decline? There were frequent localized war in the Europe during 19th century. Soldiers were not enough. Good cavalry was needed of hour. It led to the growing importance of the new section of people, that is the knights. They were linked to the lords. The lords gave the knights a piece of land that were called fief. Land of fief was cultivated by peasants. The lieu of that, the knight paid his lord a regular fees and also promised to fight for him in the war. In this way, they became a distinct group. The fall of feudalism was one of the main reasons of the decline of knights during 15th century. Question 4. What was the function of medieval monastery? The function of medieval monastery are as follow. It inspired the people to lead a simple life. It also inspired the people to serve the sick and the needy. It also inspired the people to donate for the noble cause. Imagine and describe a day in the life of craftsmen in a medieval French town. The students are advised to answer this question following guidance, basically guidance के according आंसर कर लीजिएगा. Compare the condition of life for a French sheriff and a Roman slaves. French shelf. They cultivated land that mainly belonged to Lord. Most of the produce from the land was given to Lord. They also had to work that belonged exclusively to the land and were given no wages. They could not leave the state without the prior permission of their master Lord and could not marry their children according to their wishes. The Lord could decide their fate. As a whole, their life was fully misery. Roman slaves. Slaves was in a practice in Roman society. Roman led a life full of mercy. They were forced to work for several hours. They were forced to produce more children so that they would grow up and they could made slaves. Now our next chapter, that is chapter number 5, changing cultural traditions. Chapter 5 is changing cultural traditions. From the 14th to the end of the 17th century, towns were growing in many countries of Europe. A distinct urban culture also developed. Townspeople began to think of themselves as more civilized than rural people. Towns, particularly Florence, Venice, and Rome, became center of the art and learning. Artists and writers were patronized by rich and the aristocrats. The invention of printing at the same time made books and the prints available to many peoples, including those living in the distant towns or countries. A sense of history is also developed in the Europe, and people contrasted their modern world with ancient one of Greeks and Romans. Religion came to seen as something which each individual could choose for him. The church earth-centric belief was overturned by the scientists who began to understand the solar system, and the new geographic knowledge overturned in the Europe-centric view that the Mediterranean Sea was the center of the world. There was a vast amount of material on the European history from the 14th centuries. Document, printed books, paints, sculpture, buildings, textiles. Much of these were carefully preserved in the archives, art galleries, and museums in the Europe and the America. From the 19th century, historians use the term Renaissance, literally means rebirth, to describe the culture changes of this period. The historians who emphasized this most was the Swiss scholar Jacobs Burchard, 1818 to 1907, of the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was a student of the German historian Leopold von Ranke in 1795 to 1886. Ranke had taught him that the primary concern of the historians was to write about state and the politics using paper and the files of the government department. Burchard was dissatisfied with these very limited goals that his masters had set out for him. To him, politics was not to be all and end all in this history writing. History was much concerned with the culture as with politics. In 1860, he wrote a book called The Civilization of Renaissance in Italy, in which he called his readers' attention to literature, architecture, and the painting to tell the story of now a humanist. Culture had flowered in Italy towns from the 14th to 17th century. This culture, he wrote, was characterized by a new belief that man and an individual was capable of making his own decision and developing his skill. He was modern in contrast to medieval man who thinking had to be controlled by church. The revival of Italian cities. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many of the towns that had been political and culturally centered in Italy fell into ruin. There was no unified government, and the Pope in the Rome, who was sovereign in his own state, was not a strong political figure. While Western Europe was being reshaped by the feudal bonds and the unified under the Latin Church, the Eastern Church under the Byzantine Empire and Islam was created a common civilization further west. Italy was weak and fragmented. However, it was this very developed that helped in the revival of Italian culture. With the expansion of trade between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic countries, the ports on the Italian coast revived. From the 12th century, as the Mongols opened up trade with China via the Silk Route and as with the Western European countries. Also, increased Italian population played a central role. They no longer saw themselves as a part of the powerful empire but as independent states. Two of these, Florence and the Venice, were republic, and many others were court cities ruled by the princes. One of the most vibrant city was Venice, another was the Genoa. They were different from the other part of the Europe. The clergy are not politically dominated here, nor were the powerful feudal lords, rich merchants and bankers actively participating in the governing the cities, and this helped the idea of citizenship to strike root. Even when these towns were ruled by the military deposits, the pride felt by the townspeople in being citizens did not weaken. The city-state. Cardinal Gasparin Contarini between 1483 to 1542. Writes about the democratic government of his city-state in the Commonwealth and the government of Venice between 1534. To come to the institution of our Venetian Commonwealth, the whole authority of the city is in that council into which all the gentlemen of the city, being once past the age of the 25 years, are admitted. Now first I am to yield you a recounting how and with what wisdom it was ordained by our ancestors that the common people should not admitted into this company of citizens, in whose authority is the whole power of the Commonwealth, because many troubles and the power tumults arises in those cities, though whose government is swelled by the common people. Many were of the contrary opinion, deemed that it would do well if the manner of governing the Commonwealth should be rather to be defined by the ability and the abundance of the riches. Contrariwise, the honest citizens and those that are liberally brought up of times fall to the poverty. Therefore, our voice and the prudent ancestors ordered that this definition of people rule should go further by the nobility of lineage than by the elimination of wealth, yet with the temperature provinces that men of chief and the supreme nobility should not have this rule alone, for that would rather have been the power of a few than a commonwealth, but also every other citizens, whoever not ignorably born, so that all which were nobly by the birth or ignobly by virtue did not obtain this right of government. 14th century to 15th century. In 13th century, humanism taught at Padua University in Italy. 1341, Petra given title of the poet laureate in the Rome. 1349, university established in the Florence. 1390, Geoffrey Clorici Canterbury Tales published. 1436, Baronucci designed the Duomo in the Florence. 1453, Ottoman Turks defeated the Byzantine ruler of Constantinople. 1454, Gutenberg prints the Bible with movable type. 1484, Portuguese mathematician calculated latitude by observing the sun. 1492, Columbus reaches America. 1495 Leonardo da Vinci paints the Last Supper. The 1412 Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. University and humanism. The early universities in Europe had not set up in the Italian towns. The University of Padua and the Bologna had not centered of legal studies from the 11th century. Commerce being the chief activity in the city, there was an increasing demand for the lawyer and the notaries. A combination of the solicitor and the record keeper to write the interpret rules and the written agreement, without which trade on the large scale was not possible. Law was therefore a popular subject of study, but there was now a shift of the emphasis. It was studied in the context of the early Roman culture. Francisco Petrita in 1304 to 78 represented this change. To Petrarch, antiquity was a distinctive civilization which would be the best understood through the actual words of the ancient Greek and the Romans. He therefore stressed the importance of the close reading of the ancient authors. This educational program implies that there was a much to be learned about religious teaching alone could not be gave. This was a culture which historians in the 19th century were to able the humanized by the early 15th century. The term humanist was used for the masters who thought grammars, rectors, poets, historians and the moral philosophy. The Latin word humanities, from which humanities was derived, had been used many centuries ago by the Roman lawyers and the essayist Cicero in 106 to 43 before Common Era, a contemporary of the Julius Caesar to mean culture. These subjects were not drawn from our connects with the religion and emphasize the skill developed by the individuals through discussion and debates. Giovanni Pico del Mirandola 1463 to 94, a humanist of the Florence, wrote an importance of debate in on the dignity of man. 1486, for Plato and Aristotle, it was the certain that for the attain of the knowledge of truth, they were always seeking for themselves. Nothing is better than to attain as possible as the exercise of the debate. For just as the body energy is strengthened by the gymnastic exercise, so being doubt in the wrestling place of the latter, as it were energy of the mind, becomes far stronger and the more vigorous. These revolutionary ideas attracted attention in the many other universities, particularly in the newly established university in the Petrarch's own hometown of the Florence. Till the end of the 13th century, the city has not made a mark as the center of the trade or the learning, but things changed dramatically in the 15th century. A city is known by its great citizens as much as its wealth. Florence had come to be known because of the Dante's Alighieri. 1265 to 1361, layman who wrote on the religious themes, and Giotto in 1267 to 1337, an artist who painted lifelike portraits very different from the Stephen figures done by early artisans. From then it developed as the most exciting intellectual cities in Italy, and as a center of artistic creativity. The term Renaissance man is often used to describe a person with many interests and skills, because many of individuals who became well known at this time were people of the many parts. They were scholar, diplomat, the theologians, artisans combined in one. The humanist view of history. Humanists thought that they were the restoring true civilization after centuries of darkness, for they believe that a dark age had set up in after the collapsing of the Roman Empire. Following them, later scholars unquestioningly assumed that a new age had begun in the Europe from the 14th century. The term Middle Age / Medieval Age was used for the minimal 1000 years. After the fall of Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, they argue that the church had such complete control over men's mind that all the learning of the Greek and the Roman had been blotted out. The humanists used the word modern for the period of the 15th century. Periodization used by the humanists and by the later scholars. 5th to 14th century, the Middle Age. 5th to 9th century, the Dark Age. 9th to 11th century, the Early Middle Age. 11th to 14th century, the Late Middle Age. 15th century onward, the Modern Age. Recently, historians have questioned this division, with more research being done and the more being found out about Europe in this period. Scholars are increasingly reluctant to make sharp division between centuries in terms of being culturated, vibrant or otherwise. It seems unfair to label any period as Dark Age. Science and the philosophy. The Arabs' contribution. Much of the writings of the Greek and Romans had become familiar to monks and the clergymen through the Middle Age, but they had not made this widely known. In the 14th century, many scholars began to read translated work of Greek writers like Plato and Aristotle. For this, they had indebted not to their own scholars but to Arab translators who had carefully preserved and translated ancient manuscripts. Plato was a Platon and Aristotle in Arabic. The Greek translator work of the Arabic and the Persian scholars for further transmission to the other Europeans. These were work on the natural science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine and the chemistry. Ptolemy the Almast work on the astronomy, written the Greek before 140 Common Era and later translated into Arabic, carries the Arabic definite article al, which brings out the Arabic connection. Among the Muslim writers who were regarded as the men of wisdom in the Italian world were Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Latin between 1980 to 1037, an Arabian physician and philosopher of Bukhara in Central Asia, and Al-Razia in Raziz, author of the Medical Encyclopedia. Ibn Rusad Averroes in Latin between 1126 to 98, an Arab philosopher of Spain, tried to resolve the tension between philosophical knowledge, philanthropy and the religious belief. His mention was adopted by the Christian thinkers. Humanists reach out to peoples in the variety of ways. Through the curricula in the universities continue to dominated by law, medicine and the theologist, human subjects slowly began to introduced in the school, not just in Italy but in other European countries as well. Artist and the realism. Formal education was not only the way through the humanists shaped the mind of their age. Art, architecture and books were wonderfully effective in the transmitting humanist idea. Art is embedded in nature. He who can extract it has it. Moreover, you may be demonstrated much of your work by the geometry. The more closely work abidized by the life in its form, so much is better it will appear. No man shall ever be able to make a beautiful figure out of his own imagination unless he has well stored his mind by much copying from life. His sketch by the Durer praying hands give us a sense of Italian culture in the 6th century, when people were deeply religious but also had a sense of confidence in man's ability to achieve near perfection and unravel the mysteries of the world and the university. Praying hands, brush drawing by the Durer in 1508. Artists were inspired by the studying work of the past. The material remains of the Roman culture was sought with a much excitement as ancient text. 1000 years after the fall of the Roman Fragments of the art were discovered in the ruins of the ancient Rome and the other deserted cities. Their administration for the figures of the perfectly proportioned men and women sculpture so many centuries ago made Italian sculpture want to continue that tradition. In 1416, Donatello 1386 to 1466 broke new ground with his lifelike statues. Artists concerned to accurate was helped by the work of the scientist. To study bone structure, artists went to the laboratories of the medical school. Andrew YEStudies 1414 to 64, a Bulgarian and a professor of medicine at the University of Padua, was the first to dissect the human body. This was the beginning of the modern physiologist. This self-portrait is by the Leonardo da Vinci between 1450 to 1419, who had an amazing range of interest about botany and anatomy to mathematics and arts. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. One of his dreams was to be able to fly. He spent years observing birds in the flight and designing a flying machine. He signed his name Leonardo da Vinci, discipline of experts. Discipline of experiments. Painters did not have older works to use as model, but they, like sculptors, painted as realistically as possible. They found that that a knowledge of geometry helped them understand the perspective and that by noticing the changing quality of the light they pictured acquiring a little dimension quality. The use of oil as the medium for the paint also gave a greater richness of the color to the painting than before. In the colors and the design of the costume in the many paintings, this is the evidence of the influence of the Chinese and the Persian art made available to them by the Mongols. Thus, anatomy, geometry, physics, as well as the strong sense of the what was the beautiful gave a new quality of Italian art, which was called to be the realism and which continued till the 19th century. Architecture. The city of Rome revived in the spectacular way in the 15th century. From 1417, the popes were politically stronger because the weakness caused by the election of the two rivals pope since 1378 has ended. They actively encouraged the study of the Rome's history. The ruins in the Rome were carefully excavated by the archaeologists. Archaeology was a new skill. This inspired a new style of architecture, which was actually a revival of the imperial Roman style, now called the classical popes. Wealthy merchants and the aristocrats employed architects who were familiar with the classical architecture. Artists and the sculptors were also with the decorated buildings and the paintings, sculpture and the reliefs. Some individuals were skilled equally as the painters, sculptors and the architectures. The most impressively example is Michelangelo Buonarroti in 1475 to 1764, immortalized by the selling of the painted for the Pope in the Sistine Chapel for the sculpture called the Pieta, and his design of the dome of the St. Peter's Church, all in the Rome. Filippo Brunelleschi in 1337 to 1446, the architecture who designed the spectacular Duomo of the Florence, had started his career as a sculptor. Another remarkable change was that from of the time artisans were known individually by the name, not a member of the group or a guild as earlier. The first printed book. If the people in the other countries wanted to see paintings, sculptures or buildings or the great artists, they had to travel to Italy. But in the case of the written words, what was the written in the Italy traveled to other countries. This was because of the greatest revolution of the 16th century, the mastery of the technology of painting. For this, Europeans were indebted or the other peoples, the Chinese for the painting technology, and to the Mongol rulers because European traders and the diplomats has become familiar with it during the visit of their courts. This was also the case with the three other important innovations: firearms, the compass and the abacus. Earlier text existed in the few handwritten copies. In 1455, 150 copies of Bible were written in the workshop of the Johannes Gutenberg 1400 to 1458. The German who made the first printing press. Early a monk would have taken the same amount of time to write one copy of the Bible. By 1500 many classical texts, nearly all in the Latin, had been printed in Italy. As printed books became available, it was possible to buy them, and students did not have depend solely on the literature notes. Idea, opinion and information moved more widely and more rapidly than ever before. A printed book prompting the new ideas could quickly each 100 of the readers. This also made it possible for individuals to read books, since it was possible to buy copies for oneself. This developed the reading habits among the people. The chief reason that the humanist culture of the Italy spread more rapidly across the Alps from the end of the 15th century is that printed books were circulating. This also explains why the earlier intellectuals movement have been limited to the particular region. A new concept of human beings. One of the features of the humanist culture was a slacking of the control of the religious over human life. Italians were strong attracted to the materials, wealth, power and glory, but they were not necessarily irreligious. Francisco Barbocco in 1390 to 1454, a humanist from Venice, wrote a pamphlet defending acquisition of the wealth as the virtue. On pleasure, Laros Wala 1406 to 1457, who believed that the study of history led men to strive for a life of perfection. Criticism that Christianity injunction against pleasure. There was also a concern at this time with the manners. Now one should speak politely and dress correctly, what skills a person of the culture should learn. Humanism also implies that individuals were capable of shaping their own lives through means other than the mere pursuit of the power and the money. This idea was closely tied with the belief that the human nature was mainly sided, which went against the three separate orders that feudal society believed in. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote the human nature in the 15th chapter of this book, The Prince, in 1513. So leaving this imaginary things and referring only of those which are truly exist, I say that whenever men are discussed, and especially princes who were more exposed to view, they are noted for the various equalities which were earned them either the praise or the condemnation. Some, for the example, are held to be generous and the grapesing, some cruel, some compassionate, one of the faithless, another faithful, one more effeminate and the crowdy, another faint and the courageous, one man courteous, another proudly, one man lavishious, another purge, one guideless, another craftily, one stubborn, another flexible, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another skeptical, and so forth. Machiavellian believed that all men are bad and every ready to display their vigorous nature, partially because of their fact that the human desires are insatiable. The most powerful motive Machiavellian saw as the incentives for the every human action for its self-interest. The aspirations of women. The ideal of the individual and the citizenship excluded women. Men from aristocratic family dominated public life were the decision makers in their families. They educated their sons to take their place in the family business or in public life, at times spending their younger sons to join the church, although their dowries were invested in the family business. A woman generally had no say in how their husband could run their business. Often marriages were intended to strengthen business alliance. If an adequate dowry could not be arranged, daughters were sent to the convents to live the life of a nun. Obviously, the public role of the woman was limited and they were looking upon the keepers of the households. The position of women in the families of merchants, however, was somewhat different. Shopkeepers were often assisted by their wives in the running the shops. In families of merchants, the bankers' wives looked after the businesses when the male members were away on the work. The early death of the merchants compelled his widow to perform a large public role than was the case of the aristocratic family. A few women were intellectually very creative and sensitive about the importance of the humanist education, even though the study of the latter promises and the often no rewards for women and no dignity, wrote the Venetian cassette Fedele in between 1465 to 1558. Every woman vowed to seek the embrace of these studies. She was one of the handful of the women who questioned the idea that woman was incapable of the achieving the qualities of the humanist scholar. Fedele was known for the proficiency in the Greek and the Latin and was invited to give orientation at the University of Padua. Fedele writing brings into focus the general regard for the education in that age. She was one of the Venetian women writers who criticized the public for the creating a higher limited definition of the freedom that flavored the desire of the men, whoever those of women. Another remarkable woman was the Marchesa of Mantua, Isabella of Distia, between 1774 to 1759. She ruled the state while her husband was absent. The court of the Mantua, a small state, was famed for its intellectual brilliance. Women's writing revealed their conviction that they should have economic power, poverty and education to achieve an identity in a world dominated by men. Balthasar Constantino, author and the diplomat who wrote his book The Courtier between 1528, I told that a woman should in no way resemble a man as regards her way, manner, word, gesture and bearing. Thus, just as it would be fitting that the man should display a certain robust and sturdy manliness, so it well for a woman to have a certain soft and the delicate tenderness, with an air of feminine sweetness in her every moment, which in her going to staying and whatever she does always makes her appear a woman without a resemblance to a man. If this percept to added to the rules that these gentlemen have taught the courtiers, when I was thinking that she ought to be able to make use of the many of them, the adorn himself with the finest accomplishment. For I considered that many virtues of the mind are as necessary to be woman as to be man, as it is good to be good family, to shun affections, to be naturally graceful, to be well managed, clever and the prudent, to be neither proud, envious or even tuft nor vain, to perform well and graceful the sport suitable for women. Debates within Christianity. Trade and travel, military conquest and the diplomatic contracts linked Italian towns and the court with the world beyond. The new culture was admired and imitated by the educated and the wealthy. Very few of new ideas fitted down the ordinary man who after all could not read or write. In the 5th century and the early 6th century, many scholars in the universities in the North Europe were attracted to the humanist idea. Like their Italian colleagues, they too focused on the classical Greek and the Roman text along with the holy books of the Christian, but unlike Italy where professional scholar dominated the humanist movement, in North Europe humanism attracted many members of the church. They called the Christians to practice religious in the way laid down the ancient text of their religious, discarding unnecessary ritual after they condemned as the later traditions to a simple religion. There was a radical new view of the human being as free and the rational agents. Later philosophers were to be returned to his over and over again, inspired by the belief in the distant God who created man but allow him complete freedom to live his new freely and pursuit of the happiness here and now. Christian humanists like Thomas More 1478 to 1535 in England and Erasmus 1462 to 1536 in Holland felt that the church has become an institution marked by the greed, exporting money at will from the ordinary people. One of the favoring methods of the clergy was to sell indulgence documents and apparently free the buyer from the burden of the sins he had committed. Christians came to realize from the printed translation of the Bible and the local language that their religions did not permit such practices. In almost every part of the Europe, peasants began to rebel against the taxation imposed by the church, while common folk resented the extortions of the churchmen. Princes found their interference in the work of the state irritating. They were pleased when the humanists point out that the clergy claimed to be judicial and the physical power originated from a document called the Donation of Constantine, supposed to have been issued by the Constantine, the first church Roman emperor. Humanist scholars were able to point out that out of this not genuine and had not been forged letter. In 1517, a young German monk called Martin Luther, between 1483 to 1456, launched a campaign against the Catholic Church and argued that a person did not need priest to establish contract with the God. He asked the followers to have complete faith in God, for faith along with the guides them to the right life and enter into heaven. This movement, called the Protestant Reformation, led to the churches in Germany and the Switzerland breaking their connection with the Pope and the Catholic Church. In Switzerland, Luther ideas were popularized by the Ulrich Zwingli between 1484 to 1531 and later by the Jean Calvin between 1419 to 64, backed by the merchant. The reformers has greater popular appeal in the towns, while in the rural areas of the Catholic Church managed to retain its influence. Other German reformers like the Anabaptists were even more radical, even blended the idea of salvation with the end of the all reforms of the social oppression. They said that since God had created all of us equal, they were not expected to pay taxes and had not right to close their priests. They appealed to be peasants oppressed by the feudalism. William Tyndale, between 1494 to 1536, an English Lutheran who translated the Bible into English in 1506, defended Protestantism. Thus, in this we all agree to divide you from the knowledge of the scripture, and that yell not have to text thereof in the mother tongue, and to keep the world still in the darkness, to intend they might sit in the consciences of the people through vain superstitions and the false doctrine, to satisfy their proud ambitions and the insatiable conventionality, and exalt their own honor above the king and the emperor, yeah, above God himself, which things only moved me to translate the New Testament, because I prevailed by the experiences how that it impossible to establish the lay people in the other truth, except the scripture were merely laid before their eyes in their mother tongue, that they might see the process, order and meaning in the text. Luther did not support radicalism. He called upon the German ruler to suppress the peasants' rebellion, which they did in the 1525, but radicalism survived and they merged with the resistance of Protestants in France, who persecuted by the Catholic rulers started claiming and the right of a people to remove an oppressive ruler and to choose someone of their own liking. Eventually in France, in many other parts of the Europe, in Catholic Church allowed Protestants to worship as they choose. In England, the ruler ended the connection with the Pope. In King and Queen was from then on the head of the church. The Catholic Church itself did not escape the impact of these ideas and began to reform itself from within. In Spain and Italy, churchmen emphasized the need for the simple life and service to the poor. In Spain, Ignatius Loyola, in an attempt to combat the Protestantism set up in the society by the Jesus in 1440, his followers were called the Jesuits, whose mission was to serve the poor and to widen their knowledge to other cultures. 16th to 17th century. 1516, Thomas More Utopian published. 1517, Martin Luther writes the 9th 5 Theses. 1522 Luther translates the Bible into German. 1525 peasants uprising in the Germany. 1543 Andres Vesalius write on the anatomy. 1559 Andikila Church established in England with the king and the queen as its heads. 1569 Gerplert's Marcalato prepares cylindrical map of the earth. 1582 Georgian calendar introduced by the Pope George XIII. 1628 William Harvey linked the heart with the blood circulation. 1673 Academy of Science set up in the Paris. 1687 Isaac Newton Principia Mathematica published. The Copernicus Revolution. The Christian notation of a man as a sinner was questioned from the early entire different angle by the scientists. Turning point in the Europe, science came with the work of the Copernicus between 1472 to 1543. A contemporary of the Martin Luther, Christian has believed that the earth was a sinful place and heaven burden of the things made it immobile. The earth stood at the center of the universe around which move in the celestial body. Copernicus has asserted that the planets including the earth rotate around the sun. A devout Christian, Copernicus was afraid of the possible reaction to the theory of the traditionalist clergyman. For this reason, he did not want his manuscript De Revolutionibusum, the rotation, to be printed. On his deathbed, he gave it to his followers, Josism Recrutis. It took time for the people to accept this idea. It was much later, more than half a century later, in fact, that the difference between heaven and the earth was bridged through the writing of the astronomers like Johannes Kepler. 1571 to 1630 and Galileo in Galilee 1564 to 1642. The theory of the earth as part of the sun-centered system was made popular by the Kepler cosmographic mystery, which demonstrated that the planets move around the sun not in the circle but in the ellipse. Galileo conveyed the notation of the dynamic world in his work The Motion. The revolution in the science reaches its climax with the Isaac Newton theory of gravitation. Reading the universe, Galileo once remarked that the Bible that light the road to heaven does not say much on how the heavens work. The work of this thinker showed that the knowledge as distinct from belief was based on the observations and the experiment. Once the scientists had shown the way, experiment has in the investigation into what they came to call physics, chemistry and biology expanded rapidly. Historians were to label with this new approach to the knowledge of man and nature the scientific revolution. Consequently, in the mind of the skeptic and the non-believer, God began to replace by the nature as the source of the creation. Even those who retained their faith of the God started taking about a distance of God who does not directly regulated the art of living in the material world. Such ideas were popularized to the scientific society that established a new scientific culture in the public domain. In Paris Academy, established in the 1630, and the Royal Society in the London for the promotion of the natural knowledge, formed in the 1662, held lectures and conducted experiments for the public viewing. Was a European Renaissance in the 14th century. Let us now consider the concept of the Renaissance. Can we see this period as the marking a sharp breaking with the past and the rebirth of the ideas from the Greek and the Roman tradition? Was the early period 12th and the 13th century a time of the darkness? Recent writers like Peter Berkeley of England have suggested the Birkin heart was extra aggregating and the sharp difference between this period and the one of that preceded it by the using the term Renaissance, which implies that the Greek and the Roman civilization were reborn at this time, and the scholars and the artisans of this period substituted the pre-Christian world for the Christian one. Both arguments were exaggerated. Scholars in the early centuries had been familiar with the Greek and the Roman cultures, and religions continue to be very important part from the people's life. In contrast of the Renaissance as a middle period of dynamism and artistic creativity, and the Middle Ages as a period of the gloom and lack of development in an oversimplification. Many elements associated with the Renaissance in the Italy can traced back to the 12th and the 13th century. It has been suggested by some historians that in the 9th century in France there had been similar literature and the artistic blossoming. The culture changes in the Europe at this time were not shaped only by the classical civilization of Rome and the Greece. The archaeologists and the literary recovered by the Rome culture did create this great administration of that civilization. But technology and the skill in the Asia had moved far ahead of that what the Greek and the Roman had known. Much more of the world has become connected, and the new techniques of the navigation, see theme 8, enabled people to sail much further than had been possible earlier. The expansion of Ismail and Mongol conquest has linked Asia and the North Africa with the Europe, not exponentially but in terms of the trade and the learning skills. Europe learned not just from the Greek and the Romans, but from India, from the Arabs, and from Iran, from Central Asia, from China. These depths were not acknowledged for a long time, because when the historians of this period started to be written, history saw it from a Europe-centered viewpoint. And important changes that did happen in this period was that gradually and the private and the public spheres of the life began to become separate. The public spheres mean to be area of the government and of formal region. The private spheres included the family and the personal religions. The individual had a private as well as a public role. He had not simply a member of one of these three orders. He had to be also a person in his own right. An artisan was not just a member of the crowd, he was also known for it himself. In 18th century, this sense of the individual would be expressed in a political form, in the belief that all individuals has equal political rights. Another development was that the different religions of Europe started to have their separate sense of identity based on the language. Europe, earlier united partially by the Roman Empire and later by the Latin and Christianity, was now dissolved into states, each unity by a common language. Questions. What was the first question? Which element of Greek and the Roman culture were revived in the 14th century and 15th century? The religious, artistic, and literary element of Greek and Roman culture were revived in the 14th and 15th century. Question 2. Compare detail of the Italic architecture of this period with the Islamic architecture. Huge buildings were constructed under both the Italian and the Islamic architecture. Decoration was prominent in both the styles. Arc and the pillars were important characteristics of both the Italian and the Islamic architectures. Beautiful cathedrals and monasteries were constructed in Italian architecture, whereas large and the magnificent mosques were constructed under the Islamic style of architecture. Why were the Italian towns the first to experience the ideas of humanism? The towns of the Italy were the first to experience the idea of humanism because of the following reasons. The education spread in the Italy by the 13th and the 14th century. Humanism as a subject was the first taught in Italy school, college and universities. Italian peoples were made aware of the humanist view of ideas. Universities were first of the all developed had been spread education. A number of classical books were composed by Roman and Greek scholars. Compare the Vatican idea of good government with those of the contemporary France. Venice was an Italian city. This city was free from the influence of the church and feudal lords. In Venice, bankers and rich merchants play a significant role, while there was absolute monarchy in France. In France, common people were deprived of their rights. What were the features of the humanist thought? Humanist thought laid stress on the skill and the ideas that were developed by the individuals through debate and discussion. These revolutionary ideas attracted attention of the many other universities, particularly in the new established university in the Petro's native town Florence. The humanists throughout increased dignity of the human beings. Humanism embodies a mystical and atheistical temper of the pre-scientific age. It laid stress on the logical nature, science, and the metaphysics. It laid emphasis not only on the intellectual learning but also on the physical and the moral development. Humanism relied on the flexible thinking. After Petrarch, the humanist philosophy spread first through Italy, then into the other parts of the Europe. Humanist through was reflected in the contemporary art and architecture. Petrarch represented conservatives' Italian humanism. Humanism embodies the mythical and the aesthetical temper of a pre-scientific age. The intellectuals of antiquity were relatively unconcerned about the supernatural world and the eternal density of the soul. They were mainly interested in the public and the accurate and efficient life on the earth. The leading intellectual triads of the era was the recovery of the secular and the humane philosophy of Greece and Rome. The writing of Dante, particularly the doctrine of Petrarch and the humanist like Machiavellian, emphasized the virtue of intellectual freedom and individual expression. In the essay of Montaigne, the individualistic view of life received the most persuasive and eloquent statement in the history of literature and society. Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, Mona Lisa, Machiavellian, The Last Judgment, Fall of Man, and Raphael Madonna were the most important works. Write the careful account of how the world appeared different to the 7th century Europe. Renaissance movement brought about the rational and the scientific approach in the life of mankind, but world appears quite different. Scientists used the method of experimentation, observation, and new thought. It was just contemporary to the Christian beliefs. Scientific discoveries of the Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Isaac Newton brought about new changes in the world. The Italian scientist Galileo invented telescope. Newton gave theory of the gravitation. He systematized scientific valuation about the universe. Copernicus tried to prove that the earth rotates around the sun. Marco Polo invention of the compass made voyages easier. The exploration of the savior like Vasco da Gama, Columbus, etc. led to the discoveries of new lands. Their exploration revolutionized trade. The invention of the printing press made books available to the peoples of the various towns and the cities. Rome, Florence, Venice became the center of the art and learning. Many artisans, scholars, and the writers were patronized by the rich peoples in the cities and the towns. Towns became the center of the art and the learning activities. Thomas More, Utopia, ridiculed the malpractice of the contemporary society. On above basis, it was said that the world appeared different to the 17th century's Europe. Thank you and subscribe.